Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhamman Sangham Namassami. First of all, welcome De Sumino, welcome Honorary Drew. The joy on the Uposatha is the one time in the monthly calendar where monastics are supposed to get together. Every other time we can be totally aloof from each other and just kind of spread out into the forest. But if we're around other monastics on the new and full moon, we're supposed to get together to reaffirm our keeping of the precepts, to delight in each other's company, and to practice together, even if just for that night before spreading back out. It's a wonderful practice to be able to take on, and it is this evening. We've arrived, and it's a special full moon because tomorrow we begin our 3-month period known as the Vassa. And the Vassa is a time of stability. It's the monsoon season in India. And so we actually have regulations around this as monastics that we're supposed to take a vow of stability and have a shelter during this monsoon season. In most years, we joke that, for some reason, the monsoon season here in North America is not very rainy. It's usually the heat of summer, but actually this year has been pretty rainy. People have been using the N word to describe it. So it's very appropriate that we have shelter and we have a place here in our town in Western Massachusetts, and we're about to take that vow of stability to be together and to be part of this community, to not range far and wide, but to settle down and commit to practice. And this is the opportunity we get during the Vassa to really set our wandering mind aside and endure the conditions, endure the rain, endure the bugs, endure whatever is going on, and walk for alms, same streets every day, meet the same people, and offer what we can to a community. This is what we're about to embark on. And it's in the modern day, the community is not just in person, but also an online community. And we have this opportunity to gather and to recommit. And I thought in this evening, there's a particular theme of Dhamma I've been thinking about lately. And it can be encompassed by a question I think we all ask many, many times during our life. Should I stay or should I go? And we ask ourselves this question in all sorts of situations, be it a job, or a relationship, or a housing situation, to say nothing of as monastics. We're often looking at the situation we're in and assessing, is this where I want to be? Is this where I need to be to practice? And when facing this question, the Buddha actually gave a very powerful teaching, a teaching which casts a net, which can be through logic, can encompass all of the questions of should I stay or should I go. But he framed it in terms of the monastic practice. And it's only until he turns it around partway through the teaching that you realize its scope. And this teaching is found in the middle length discourses, sutta number 17, which is called Jungle Thickets. And in this teaching, the Buddha actually begins by framing it from the context of a monastic, a monk or nun who is out in the forest, practicing as they've been taught, living simply, maybe even living alone. And this monastic from time to time should assess their situation. If the idea comes up, should they stay or should they go? The Buddha says they should look at two things. They should look at their access to the four requisites, the four basic necessities of life, which is clothing, food, shelter, and medicine. And they should look at their practice. Are they abandoning those unwholesome qualities which have yet to be abandoned? And are they realizing those insights and that liberation that has not yet been realized? And the Buddha said, when you consider this, then you can set up a sort of framework to assess. The Buddha said, if you're looking at your situation and you don't have access to the four requisites, they're not easy to get. You can't get enough clothing, you can't get enough food, your shelter's too poor, and you're not developing in practice. The Buddha said, you shouldn't stay. You should leave that very night. If you're looking and you don't necessarily, you have access to the five requisites, you have four requisites. You have clothing, food, shelter, medicine. Maybe you're even living very comfortably. But you assess that you're not developing spiritually. And the Buddha said, after considering, you should consider, maybe I should leave. It's not an immediate. You might assess, well, maybe this will turn around, or maybe I'm just working through something. But if it seems like you've been stagnating for some time, even if you have access to the resources, the Buddha said, you didn't come out here for the clothing, food, and shelter, and medicine. So you should go. If you're making this assessment and you don't really have good access to the four requisites, but you are developing spiritually, the Buddha said, after consideration, you should try and find a way to stay. Maybe there's some way you can make it work, because after all, what is more important than spiritual progress, spiritual development, and freedom, lasting freedom? And the Buddha said, if you look at your situation and you find that you have access to the four requisites and that you are developing spiritually, then you should stay. You should not leave there, even until the end of your life. So very definitive statements, and those that sort of transcend our preferences in a way. If it were just there, then that would be all well and good for those 0.01% of human beings who decide to be hermits. But the Buddha then turns it around, and he uses the same framework for those who are living in community, those who are living dependent on a teacher. And he says the very same thing. If you don't have the requisites, you're not developing, leave. If you have the requisites, but you're not developing, think about leaving. If you don't have the requisites, but you're developing, think about staying. And if you have both, stay. Don't even think about it. And this is a very powerful teaching, a very powerful net. Because when we look at it, we see that it transcends the normal logic we use to try to figure out if we should stay somewhere or go. Because the Buddha is not talking about whether or not the situation is pleasant or unpleasant. He's not talking about if it's profitable or unprofitable. He's not talking about is it making us happy or is it not making us happy? The Buddha is framing this from the standpoint of a very mature practitioner, somebody who's willing to make sacrifices in order to cultivate their heart. And the Buddha is doing this for a particular reason, because he's assessing what's really most important deep down. This is a good reminder for us when we're looking at our situation in life. We see that the framework the Buddha has, on one side, we have the four requisites. We have survival. And the Buddha doesn't rule this out. He says it's actually an important criteria. Is your life going to be cut short by practicing in this place? And this is something we can apply to our jobs, our relationships, our living situations. Is it safe? Is it healthy? Are we wasting away? Are we being exposed to environmental hazards? Are we doing something dangerous? And in a relationship context, in an interpersonal context, as in community, are we developing bad habits? Are we in a situation where anger is growing, where resentment is growing, where we're being traumatized? Well, this is not a healthy situation. All of these things will impact us. And the Buddha says we should really assess whether that is within our tolerance levels. Slightly more important are the spiritual rewards of what we're doing. And this goes beyond the scope of a single human lifetime. So the Buddha and Buddhist cosmology, Buddhist philosophy is based on the idea that the mind and its processes last. They last beyond the scope of a single lifetime. And so if we are developing bad patterns in this lifetime, those bad patterns are not going to go away. And this could be a matter of faith for some people. They've seen this in their own lives, how mental patterns stick around, but when they're overcome, then they're overcome for good. But for others, it's more of an equation. Maybe these things disappear at the end of my life, or maybe they keep going. But if they disappear at the end of my life, and I cultivated a good life and a good heart and a good mind, I still live peacefully in the here and now. But if they keep going, then it's really important that I develop spiritually, because that will be the only thing that I take with me. We don't get to take our money, we don't get to take our family, we don't get to take our possessions with us. But we will take our habits, our hearts, our mental patterns. If we're given to greed and we pass away, then the rebirth that might happen, whatever state we might be, according to Buddhist philosophy, that greed would follow us, would be with us. Likewise with anger, likewise with delusion. But if we were to cultivate non-greed, generosity, renunciation, contentment, well, then those would be the states that would be reborn. And that actually sounds pretty pleasant, doesn't it? It sounds like something to work towards. It almost sounds like a gift. After all, the person that we are now wouldn't get to know the future person that receives the mind states we're cultivating. But that future person will probably be pretty grateful that we took the time in our human life to cultivate them. Practicing non-hatred, Living a heart of loving kindness, practicing non-delusion, developing in mindfulness, in meditation, in clarity. Even the act of developing right effort, the desire to develop wholesome mind states, to abandon unwholesome ones. This is powerful, powerful mental karma. And the Buddha is putting this as more important than our survival necessarily. If we had a real shot at spiritual liberation and nibbana, then we should go for it. We should strive. We should be willing to endure difficulty, pain, suffering, and trials, challenges in order to get that. And one famous sutta, the Buddha even went so far as to say, if somebody were to come up to you and give you an honest offer that they could guarantee you would attain stream entry, the first level of enlightenment, that level of enlightenment that leads, but guaranteed to lead to full enlightenment. It's a linear path. He said, if somebody could guarantee that to you on one condition, that for the next 100 years, you would have to be stabbed with 100 spears in the morning, 100 spears in the afternoon, and 100 spears in the evening. As one teacher, Ajahn Sucitto, put it, you should shake that man's hand. You should take that deal, because that is a good deal. After all, the suffering you would experience in 100 years of getting stabbed with spears will be nothing compared to the mass of suffering that you give up by entering the path to enlightenment, which leads in no really long time, at most a number of lifetimes, but possibly within a single lifetime, once you realize what needs to be done and once you have committed to it, you tend to get to that goal. If you had a shot at that, then you should take it, no matter what the challenge is. But for most of us, this matrix that the Buddha sets up in Majjhima Nikaya 17 is about all we need to think about: survival and spiritual growth. I first heard this teaching shortly after I showed up at the monastery. And I had showed up at the monastery not caring about ordination, but knowing I wanted to be a monk. I had seen enough of the spiritual traditions, and I had traveled to Asia. And when I had seen Buddhist monks in Thailand, I had said, that's great. I think that's what I want to do. I saw them walking for alms in the streets of Bangkok, and they looked peaceful. And the people around them looked peaceful. There was this flow and rhythm to the day. And it was this sort of dance that everybody was part of. And I said, something about this really works. But I knew I'd have to come back to America, and I knew that necessarily I would be leaving the tried and tested format that I had seen in Thailand, and I'd be experiencing something new. I'd be experiencing American Buddhism, whatever that was. None of us really knows exactly for sure. We use Japanese sitting cushions and Sri Lankan chanting and Thai honorifics, but it all kind of works. It all kind of works because none of those things is the Dhamma. The Dhamma is those practices which develop the heart. And so I came to the monastery, and I had been in the military. I had been in Iraq. I was still a little messed up in the head, a little traumatized from everything I had been through. And so being around other people and committing to spiritual discipline, giving up dinner, oh my God, I was putting some strain on my system. Likewise, being part of a community, a very active spiritual community, was not easy. And particularly for Americans, getting along with each other being in each other's personal bubble without driving each other absolutely insane. It didn't come naturally. And so there were plenty of times, right from the get-go, when I'm like, okay, maybe I should keep looking. Maybe I should try another monastery. Maybe I should try another tradition. I didn't go so far as maybe I should try another religion, but definitely there's many different forms and flavors of Buddhism. And the idea did come up that maybe I should keep shopping around. But I was very fortunate to hear this teaching early on. And it said two simple things. Look at, can you get what you need to survive? And will you grow? And so every time I was challenged and my mind started to think about going, I would think back to that teaching. And I'd be like, well, the monastery is good and stable, and I have food and clothing and shelter. And if I didn't, there are people around me who really care about my survival and my practice, and they would provide them. And then I looked at my growth and I said, well, this is not pleasant, but that's not what's being asked. It's not about, am I enjoying it or not, but am I developing? And I saw that in a really profound way in that environment, taking on the precepts, practicing meditation morning and evening, and hearing the Dhamma over and over again, studying it in written form, and living it, practicing it. Everything we did is shaped by Buddhist teachings. I realized that I was developing. And so, in some ways, I turned off that part of my mind that was saying, but maybe you can do better. And I said, no, I'm getting what I need to. And so I should see this through. And I kept doing that. And it kept working. And then there came a time when I noticed I was still getting the 4 requisites, but I wasn't developing so much. I had kind of plateaued. And I said, well, that's interesting, but I'm going to keep an eye on this. I didn't immediately head out the door, but I was starting to think, and I was starting to pack my bag. And it went on for a number of months. And after a while, I started to say, okay, well, this doesn't seem to be working out. I think I've gotten what I can from this situation. It's now time to strike out. I think I'm ready to explore a new kind of practice. And specifically, I had not been looking to live in a monastery. My original inspiration had been to be a forest monk, to be a wandering monk. But I didn't have the training necessary to flourish in that lifestyle. But after 7 years at the monastery, I found that I did. And that my path was now leading elsewhere. And so without bitterness or resentment, I looked at that very same formula, and with a change of conditions, I saw that it was now time to go. I put on my bag and I left. And so every place that we find ourselves in life, this is a teaching that we can put into effect, that we can study and try out, try using as a benchmark. It works most effectively when we do have a knowledge of the Dhamma, when we do have a path set out in front of us that outlines spiritual virtues. What is development? What is worth developing? What are unwholesome states and what are wholesome states? Without that, we're like most of the people in the world. They think this is good, they think this is bad, they hear this is good, they hear that is bad. They try and do the best that they can, but they don't have enough information. But once we're exposed to a teaching that's linear, that has a goal, that offers us a way to change and to improve and to grow, well, then we really have what we need to plug in this formula and say, well, am I growing? Am I learning? And if we find that we are, then we don't have to think any further than that. we may be exactly where we need to be. I know in situations in regular life, lay life, where we look and um, be it a job, a relationship, a living situation, anything, this still applies. And if we're at a job and we find that it's making money, it helps us pay our bills, but it leaves us feeling awful at the end of the day, then we should consider, is it in line, is it right livelihood? Is it in line with our values? Is it good for us? Is it good for others? Chances are, if it feels unpleasant, uncomfortable, then something is off. Maybe it's a matter of the precepts. Maybe we actually do have to say, I'm willing to work here, but I'm not willing to do that. If we line it up against the precepts and we find that something is out there. But if everything's within the precepts, it could just be a condition that it doesn't fit us. Or maybe it's exactly what we need. We just don't like it. And this is the human realm. Sometimes we need to earn our daily bread. We need to do it with the sweat of our brow. Particularly young people starting out, they don't get paid as much as old people who are established and skilled and have a long resume. And that's just the way things are. It doesn't mean we should keep changing jobs until we're making a ton of money and we're doing exactly what we want to do. We can just assess, is this leading in the right direction? Am I growing? Am I investing in an appropriate way? And likewise in our relationships. Are we just fighting? Are we just developing? Are we just gathering ammunition for our next argument? Or are we committed to each person's growth, each person's happiness and success, even if that means letting go and moving on? Living situations, this is particularly useful because in terms of shelter, are we keeping the rain off of our heads? Are we warm enough that we don't catch a cold? It's very easy to be thinking of better shelters, but is it satisfying our needs? And I find this is particularly powerful in terms of shelter, not just because I've been known to just, walk off into the woods and set up a tent and be like, oh, okay, I'm dry. That's good enough. But because I found that often this is a really powerful place to develop contentment. What do we need to get by? If a badger can crawl into a hole, and as long as it's got air and it's kind of snuggled in, it's surrounded by mud and ants crawling all over the place, but it's cozy. And you're like, well, if that's shelter for an animal, most human beings are doing much better than that. And this is the thing. When we satisfy our requirements, when we've got what we need, everything else can be about the spiritual aspect, can be about our growth. Letting that go and letting that be our main compass heading, getting enough to survive, and then asking these questions. And this can it can always be improved. You can always learn more and get better at how we make this assessment. If we're willing to just sit down and be honest about our situation and honest about how we're doing on the inside. And so I offer this reflection beginning of the Vassa. We're about to commit to being in one spot for a number of months, and this is the only time in the monastic calendar when we do this. Otherwise, we could travel the world, monastery to monastery, community to community. Um, but in 3 months of the year, we say, well, actually, person to my left and right, these are going to be my companions, for better or worse. And maybe it's a white knuckle affair. Maybe we just barely get through, or maybe it's an incredible blessing. And there's even a special provision that should, at the end of the 3 months, things be going so well that we see that, regardless of the first category, this in the second category, we're all developing spiritually, and the conditions are just right. There's a special allowance to extend the monsoon season, extend the Vassa for an extra month, just to take advantage of that situation. That's how important spiritual practice is. That we can literally change our calendar based on it. That's the most important thing. And so, this being the full moon, and this being our first chance to gather, for this next coming period, I'd like to say, if this is a useful framework, I encourage you to put it to the test, try it in different situations, develop some skill with it. And if you find it's not quite your cup of tea, then just set it aside. The Buddha gave many teachings, and this doesn't necessarily have to be the one that you use as your framework for making important life decisions. But I can say that for myself, over the years, this is something I've come back to day after day, month after month, year after year. And I think it can be a great benefit if you'll give it a chance.
Vandamayam Dhamma Kathaya Sadhu Karanga Dhamma Se Sadhu
Sadhu Sadhu